Hey everybody, so I know this is a really weird way to do lab, but we're just going to have to work with what we have. And so I'm just going to do these videos for you in hopes that you can still receive the lecture information that I would have given you during lab anyways. And I have put together some assignments for you to do in Sakai, and I'll get to that here in a little bit. So first I'm going to talk to you guys about the lymphatic system, and then we will move on from there. So in terms of what to do in order to complete this module and this lab, you're going to review this PowerPoint and the video lecture. You're going to complete the Lab 21 lymphatic questions assignment in Sakai, and complete the Unit 21 Lymphatics and Immunity quiz in Sakai. And so whenever you log into Sakai and you click on our class page, if you go to Course Modules, Module 9, scroll down, you will find the links, and it's going to look exactly like this. It's going to show up exactly like this in Sakai under Module 9, Course Modules on our Sakai page. And I'll share my screen in a separate video and show you exactly where to find everything in case you're having trouble. So let's begin our discussion on the lymphatic system. It's composed of a lot of different things, but we're going to talk about some of the different vessels. And so everywhere that you see green on this photo is the lymphatic vessels, all of the lines. And lymph is actually the fluid that's going to be inside of these vessels. Just like we have blood inside of our arteries and inside of our veins, we have fluid inside of these vessels, lymph vessels. In addition to those two components, we also have lymph nodes. So all of these little dots, sort of enlargements of the vessels, are lymph nodes. And although lymph nodes are their own individual structures, they are collectively called or named by their location, and there's 4 major groups. So we have axillary lymph nodes, intestinal lymph nodes, we have cervical lymph nodes, and there's also some bronchomediastinal lymph nodes and inguinal lymph nodes that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then finally, there are a few other organs that are involved with the lymphatic system, and those include the spleen, the thymus, and tonsils. So we're going to talk about each of these different structures as we go throughout this PowerPoint. So the lymphatic system, it serves a ton of different functions in the body, but it really has 3 major functions. And these 3 major functions are the ones that we're going to focus on. So first and foremost, the lymphatic system works to transport excess interstitial fluid back to the heart. It also absorbs dietary fats and finally activates the immune system. So we're going to talk about each of these 3 primary functions over the next few slides. So again, function number 1, transport excess interstitial fluid back to the heart. So that might seem a little bit intimidating to hear, but I'm going to break it down and hopefully make this a little bit easier for you. So we've already learned that blood starts in the heart, and then it goes out the aorta into all of our arteries. And so this is the arterial side of our vessels. And then it reaches capillaries. And at the capillaries, remember, this is where gas exchange is happening. So we're dropping off oxygen and we're picking up CO2. And then the blood goes into veins, where it is eventually returned back to the heart, and we start this system over again. Now, In addition to gas exchange happening down here at these blood capillaries, we also have filtration occurring. And that just means that water that was inside of these blood vessels is actually being pushed out of blood vessels into a space between cells called the interstitium. Okay, and in this location, about 1.5 milliliters of fluid is being pushed out of the blood into this blank space, sort of in the background here, the space between the cells, every single minute. So 1.5 milliliters, excuse me, every minute of fluid is pushed out of the vessels into this background space. Now, this might not seem like a lot of fluid, but if we were not able to return the fluid that's pushed out here back into the heart, then we would lose our entire plasma volume in about 1 day. And remember, plasma is a component of blood. So remember I drew the centrifuge on the board a couple of weeks ago, and on the bottom I had red blood cells, and then I had a little buffy coat layer of the platelets and the white blood cells, and then I had that top layer, and that was all plasma. So if it's essentially the plasma volume that's being pushed out of the blood into this interstitium at a rate of 1.5 milliliters per minute. Now, once that fluid, that plasma essentially, is in this interstitial space, thankfully we have these lymphatic capillaries, which basically suck up that fluid and they return it back to the heart through this network of different lymphatic vessels. And just like veins, these lymphatic vessels also have little valves inside of them, and that prevents lymph from flowing backwards back into this interstitial space. So it prevents lymph from backflow, so we can finally eventually get it back up to the heart. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about some of these different vessels and go through the flow that lymph takes from the interstitial space down here back up to the heart. So let's do that. So I just mentioned then that the lymphatic capillaries suck up that extra fluid, and from there we send what is now lymph, because now it's inside of these lymphatic capillaries, through an afferent lymphatic vessel until it reaches a lymph node. And then it's going to be sent along an efferent lymphatic vessel. And then maybe it'll merge with another efferent lymphatic vessel, at which point it would become an afferent lymphatic vessel until it reaches another lymph node. And then it'll be sent along the efferent vessel until many efferent vessels come together and form what is a lymphatic trunk. Okay, so if you just imagine that you'd have another lymph node over here, another one here, all of these efferent vessels are going to come together and form this lymph trunk. And in the body, we have 9 major lymph trunks. So we have 2 jugular trunks, which will drain the lymph from the head and the neck areas. We have 2 subclavian trunks, which will drain lymph from our upper limbs. 2 bronchomediastinal trunks, then, which drain the lymph from our thorax, so in our chest area. 1 intestinal trunk, which will drain lymph from our abdomen area. And then finally 2 lumbar trunks, which will drain the pelvis and our lower limbs. So from the lymph trunk then, the lymph trunk is going to, so several of these lymph trunks are going to come together and form a duct. And in the body, we have 2 major lymphatic ducts. Okay, and so those include then the right lymphatic duct, which basically takes anything that's coming from the right upper limb, the right side of the head, the neck, and the thorax, and takes all of that lymph and dumps it into our right subclavian vein and our right internal jugular vein. And then from there, we know that at this point it's being added back into the blood, and the blood is then going to travel into the superior and inferior vena cavas, into the right atrium, and now we're back in circulation. So that's the right lymphatic duct. The thoracic duct actually drains lymph from the rest of the body. So anywhere that is outside of the right upper limb or right side of head, neck, and thorax is drained by the thoracic duct. So it's basically everywhere else. And the thoracic duct then is going to dump into the left subclavian and left internal jugular veins, at which point the lymph has now rejoined the blood and will travel to the superior and inferior vena cava of the heart, into the right atrium, and re-enter circulation. So that is kind of how then our lymphatic system functions to transport this excess interstitial fluid back into the heart. The second major function of the lymphatic system is to absorb dietary fats. And I pose this question, I usually pose it in class, but this is just going to have to do. Why can't we absorb fats directly from our small intestines? So if you think back, it's been a while, but let's think back to the digestive system unit. And I talked about how we break down carbs into simple sugars, and we break down our proteins into amino acids, and we break down our fats, but we don't really break down our fats until digestion doesn't start until, you got it, hopefully you're remembering that digestion of fats doesn't happen until we reach the small intestine. Unfortunately, fats are too big for us to absorb them directly. So instead, if we took a little sliver of the small intestine, so this is inside of the small intestine, we kind of cut a piece of the small intestine and now we're looking inside of it, we would see sort of this structure. And if we zoom in on the structure, we're going to find these little villi, and villi are great because they increase the surface area that's available for us to absorb things. But fats are too big to put into these little tiny vessels, these little tiny blood capillaries. So instead, we put fats into these bigger structures that are right in the middle of these villi called lacteals. And lacteals are lymphatic capillaries. And so once we put the fats into these lacteals, the lacteals will deliver those fats to lymph collecting vessels and to the intestinal trunks, which will then deliver those fats to what's called the cisterna chyli. And the cisterna chyli is this really, really large lymphatic vessel that eventually will go on to drain into the thoracic duct and back into the heart and to be put back into circulation. And this is how we absorb dietary fats. And so once they are put into circulation, they can be delivered to whatever structure they need to go to in order to be either stored or utilized for making energy. So as I mentioned before, the third major function of the lymphatic system is to activate the immune system. And there's a few different structures that help us to do this. And so I'm going to go through 4 of them that I have listed here. So first and foremost is our thymus. And the thymus is located just over the heart. If you guys remember back to the endocrine lecture. I know that was like the second week of class, but we did talk about the thymus and that it secretes these hormones called thymosin and thymopoietin. And those two hormones, essentially their whole job is to stimulate T cells or T lymphocytes to mature, right? And remember, T lymphocytes are immune system cells. They are types of white blood cells. If you remember back to our blood lecture from, it's been what, 2 weeks now? So again, the thymosin and thymopoietin stimulate T lymphocyte maturation. The other structure that's going to help to activate the immune system are these lymph nodes. And so I showed you a bigger structure, a bigger picture of those. Those were those ball-like, I guess, structures on that kind of came out of the lymphatic vessels. So whenever I drew them, well, we saw them earlier, that was like a line, which is a vessel, and that would have a little bulge, which was the node, and then a little line. So if we zoom in on what the node looks like, it actually looks like this picture here. And lymph nodes, their whole job is essentially to filter the lymph and remove any pathogens that might be in the lymph before the lymph is delivered back into the blood, back into the heart, because we don't want our blood to be circulating pathogens. In addition to the thymus and the lymph nodes, the spleen also helps to activate the immune system. So here's a picture of the spleen. It's located on the upper side, on the left upper side of the body, sort of a little bit in the back, towards the back of the body. The spleen has two major regions that we're going to talk about. And so just so I can help you orient yourself, so if this is the spleen, here's the splenic artery. So blood is going to come in to the spleen. It's going to go around this area, and then it's going to come back out via the splenic vein, at which point it would be returned up through the superior and inferior, well, this would be through the inferior vena cava back to the heart. Okay, so essentially what the spleen does is it has two major regions. So the red pulp is the region that's going to destroy old or damaged red blood cells that we have no use for. But the white pulp is the part that's going to help activate the immune system, because the white pulp surrounds these capillaries that are in the spleen. And the white pulp contains things like lymphocytes and macrophages and dendritic cells, which function to remove pathogens from the blood as it's being filtered through the spleen. So just in case the lymph nodes don't catch and remove all of the pathogens, we also have the spleen kind of working as a backup generator to remove any pathogens that might be circulating in our blood. Finally, the mucosal associated lymphatic tissue, also called MALT, are just these clusters of lymphatic tissue that are kind of randomly dispersed along mucous membranes like the GI tract. So this should hopefully make sense, because sometimes we eat food that might still have bacteria on them. And so by the time that it gets to our intestines, it's great that we have these little lymphatic tissues that are kind of spread out throughout our intestines, which can help to remove pathogens from being reabsorbed back into the blood. And the types of malt that I think, are more familiar with are the specialized types called tonsils. And so we have a few different types of tonsils. We have our pharyngeal tonsils, and the pharyngeal tonsils are also called our adenoids, and they're located in the posterior nasopharynx. We also have our palatine tonsils, and these are located in the backside of the oropharynx, so sort of the backside of the mouth. And then finally, our lingual tonsils are located at the base of the tongue. So this picture, I just gave you a more blown up picture of all of the different structures that are within the lymphatic system itself. And I did the same thing for this. So for this picture. So that's really all I have to talk to you guys about. That should be plenty of information for you guys to be able to complete the assignments. You might have to do a little bit of outside research, but hopefully not too much. And then everything in here should be plenty enough for you to complete the quiz without having any trouble. So if you guys have any questions, please just shoot me an email or send me a message on Remind, and I'll be happy to get back with you as soon as I can. But other than that, I don't have anything else. So have a wonderful week and get these assignments done.